What happens when a racist cop thinks he can get away with targeting a black woman, only to find out she's about to be his new boss? It was a setup that backfired in the worst way. Officer Steve Matthews, known for his unchecked biases, saw an opportunity to mess with a woman he believed was just another target. Little did he know, the woman he had chosen to harass was about to step into one of the most powerful positions in the police department. She wasn't just anyone. She was the newly appointed police captain. As Matthews made his move, he had no idea he was playing right into a bigger game. The tables were about to turn, but would it be too late for him to save face? Stay tuned to find out how this officer's past came back to haunt him. The consequences, they were just beginning. What started as a routine flight quickly spiraled into a moment that no one could have predicted. A successful and confident black woman boarded the plane, eager for her trip, unaware that this seemingly normal day would take an unimaginable turn. As she made her way to her seat, the pilot, a man entrusted with the safety of everyone on board, made a shocking decision. He refused to fly her. His actions were not just unprofessional, they were deeply rooted in prejudice. The cabin fell silent as passengers exchanged confused and angry glances. But the woman, shocked but composed, wasn't about to let this slide. Just when it seemed like the injustice might stand, her husband, calm, focused, and more than ready to act, stepped forward to confront the pilot. What followed was a moment of reckoning that left everyone in disbelief. Stay tuned to find out how one decision changed a man's life forever. As the passengers sat in stunned silence, the tension in the air was palpable. The pilot's refusal to fly the woman had everyone questioning his motives, but no one was prepared for what came next. The woman, her calm demeanor now wavering, turned toward her husband. He wasn't just any man. He was someone who had seen injustice before, and he knew exactly how to handle this. With a steady breath, he stood up, his voice low but firm, addressing the pilot in a way that commanded attention without raising his tone. "You'll fly my wife, or you'll face the consequences." The pilot, taken aback by his calm yet assertive response, tried to deflect, muttering something about protocol and security concerns. But his excuse didn't hold water. It was clear to everyone in the cabin what was really happening. The passengers, who had been quietly observing, began murmuring among themselves. Some were outraged, others confused, but everyone knew the situation was about to escalate. The woman's husband wasn't one to back down. He'd been in situations like this before, but this was different. This wasn't just about standing up for his wife. It was about standing up for what was right. As he continued to challenge the pilot's decision, a sense of unease spread through the flight attendants. They were caught in the middle, unsure of how to handle the situation, but they could see where this was going. And when they saw the fire in the husband's eyes, they knew that the pilot's authority was no longer the most powerful force in the room. What happens when a racist cop thinks he can get away with targeting a black woman, only to find out she's about to be his new boss? It was a setup that backfired in the worst way. Officer Steve Matthews, known for his unchecked biases, saw an opportunity to mess with a woman he believed was just another target. Little did he know, the woman he had chosen to harass was about to step into one of the most powerful positions in the police department. She wasn't just anyone. She was the newly appointed police captain. As Matthews made his move, he had no idea he was playing right into a bigger game. The tables were about to turn, but would it be too late for him to save face? Stay tuned to find out how this officer's past came back to haunt him. The consequences, they were just beginning. What started as a routine flight quickly spiraled into a moment that no one could have predicted. A successful and confident black woman boarded the plane, eager for her trip, unaware that this seemingly normal day would take an unimaginable turn. As she made her way to her seat, the pilot, a man entrusted with the safety of everyone on board, made a shocking decision. He refused to fly her. His actions were not just unprofessional, they were deeply rooted in prejudice. The cabin fell silent as passengers exchanged confused and angry glances. But the woman, shocked but composed, wasn't about to let this slide. Just when it seemed like the injustice might stand, her husband, calm, focused, and more than ready to act, stepped forward to confront the pilot. What followed was a moment of reckoning that left everyone in disbelief. Stay tuned to find out how one decision changed a man's life forever. As the passengers sat in stunned silence, the tension in the air was palpable. The pilot's refusal to fly the woman had everyone questioning his motives, but no one was prepared for what came next. The woman, her calm demeanor now wavering, turned toward her husband. He wasn't just any man. He was someone who had seen injustice before, and he knew exactly how to handle this. With a steady breath, he stood up, his voice low but firm, addressing the pilot in a way that commanded attention without raising his tone. "You'll fly my wife, or you'll face the consequences." The pilot, taken aback by his calm yet assertive response, tried to deflect, muttering something about protocol and security concerns. But his excuse didn't hold water. It was clear to everyone in the cabin what was really happening. The passengers, who had been quietly observing, began murmuring among themselves. Some were outraged, others confused, but everyone knew the situation was about to escalate. The woman's husband wasn't one to back down. He'd been in situations like this before, but this was different. This wasn't just about standing up for his wife. It was about standing up for what was right. As he continued to challenge the pilot's decision, a sense of unease spread through the flight attendants. They were caught in the middle, unsure of how to handle the situation, but they could see where this was going. And when they saw the fire in the husband's eyes, they knew that the pilot's authority was no longer the most powerful force in the room. Behind the scenes, the airline's ground crew and management were being notified, and a tense back and forth ensued. The captain, now in the spotlight, was on the defensive. He knew he was in a losing position, but his pride and arrogance were hard to suppress. He couldn't believe this was happening. How dare anyone question his authority, especially over something so trivial as a passenger's race? The more he tried to justify himself, the more his anger and prejudices became visible to those around him. It was clear this wasn't just a matter of flight protocols. It was a deeply personal issue for him. Meanwhile, the woman's husband wasn't letting up. As the conversation continued, he subtly dialed a number on his phone, and moments later, the airline's upper management joined the conversation. His voice never wavered as he calmly explained what was happening. "This is discrimination, pure and simple. I will make sure everyone knows what's going on here if we don't resolve this now." The pilot's arrogance began to falter. He could feel the walls closing in. In the span of a few moments, his decision had gone from a small, personal vendetta to a public relations nightmare. His colleagues, who had been quietly watching from the cockpit, were starting to feel the pressure too. They had a job to do, but now it was clear that the reputation of the entire airline was on the line. Would they back their fellow pilot, or would they distance themselves from his actions? The passengers were now divided. Some quietly sympathized with the woman and her husband, while others questioned the confrontation. Some believed the pilot had valid reasons for his actions, while others saw it as a personal attack. The unease was growing, and the conflict between right and wrong was no longer a simple matter of opinion. Every minute that passed made the situation more precarious. The flight attendants, caught in the middle, tried to maintain control, but their efforts were futile against the rising storm. Some began offering drinks, trying to calm the nerves of the passengers, while others stood by, unsure of what to do. Meanwhile, the pilot's refusal to back down, despite mounting pressure, only heightened the stakes. As the tension reached its peak, the woman's voice broke through the chaos. "I'm not going to let you ruin my day. But if you don't do the right thing now, I will make sure the world knows exactly who you are and what you did." Her words were soft, but they carried the weight of something much more powerful: justice. The pilot, caught between his own prejudice and the realization that his career, and possibly the airline's reputation, was in jeopardy, hesitated. Every passing second felt like an eternity. The flight attendants held their breath, waiting for the pilot's next move. Would he give in to the pressure, or would he double down on his decision? The passengers watched in anticipation, but none could predict what would happen next. The moment was teetering on the edge of something that could change everything: an incredible injustice that could be righted, or a confrontation that would spiral out of control. Either way, one thing was certain: nothing about this flight would ever be the same again. The pilot, now visibly sweating, stood rigid in the cockpit, his hands gripping the controls, unsure of how to regain control. His once unquestioned authority was crumbling, and with every passing second, his reputation was slipping further from his grasp. He knew that if he didn't act soon, the situation would spiral beyond repair. But even as the storm inside the cabin intensified, there was something else happening. The woman's husband, his eyes never leaving the pilot, was prepared for whatever came next. He'd been waiting for this moment his whole life, fighting against systems that tried to crush people like his wife, like him. His every word, his every movement had been carefully measured to bring this pilot to the edge. And now, with everything on the line, the climax was just around the corner. Would the pilot finally back down, or would he try to push through with his prejudices intact? The stakes couldn't have been higher. The passengers waited, holding their breath, as the final moments of this standoff drew closer. Just as the tension seemed to reach its peak, something unexpected happened. A sudden loud noise from the back of the cabin cut through the growing chaos. The flight attendants froze, their eyes wide with shock. A man in his mid-40s, who had been sitting quietly near the rear, stood up abruptly, his face flushed red. He pointed at the woman's husband, his voice booming across the plane. "I can't believe you're letting this happen. You think you're standing up for your wife, but you're just making this worse for all of us." The room went silent for a split second, as every eye turned toward him. It was a jarring shift in the atmosphere. He wasn't angry at the pilot, he was angry at the husband. "You think you're doing the right thing, but all you're doing is causing a scene." His voice, full of venom, carried across the cabin. "Why don't you just sit down and let the man do his job?" The woman's husband, taken aback by this sudden outburst, stood frozen for a brief moment. The audacity of the man's words seemed to hit him like a slap. The passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of how to react. Some whispered nervously, while others exchanged uneasy glances. The quiet, uneasy tension that had settled over the plane in response to the pilot's refusal to fly was now compounded by this new, unexpected confrontation. The man continued, his tone venomous and dismissive. "You think you're some kind of hero, but you're just going to make us all late. What do you know about what's really going on? You've been watching too many movies, thinking you're going to fix everything with a few righteous words. Newsflash, it doesn't work that way." The woman's husband, holding back a surge of frustration, glanced at his wife, who remained composed. She nodded slightly, encouraging him to stay calm. This wasn't just about one pilot anymore. It was about the toxic mindsets that had seeped into this plane, about the people who were so blinded by their biases that they couldn't see what was right in front of them. The stakes had just escalated. The conflict wasn't just about a racist pilot and a woman fighting for justice. Now it was about the entire cabin, the passengers who had witnessed this injustice and the ones who were actively siding with it. The flight attendants, still reeling from the sudden eruption, scrambled to regain control of the situation. One of them, trying to defuse the conflict, stepped in between the two men, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. But it only added fuel to the fire. The man from the back wasn't backing down. He was relentless, his voice growing louder, his frustration more palpable. "I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking," he snapped, looking around the cabin as if expecting everyone to nod in agreement. But there were no nods. There was only a growing tension, a shift in the mood that everyone could feel. The passengers who had previously been quiet, some sympathetic to the woman, others uncertain, now began to speak up. A few murmurs of support echoed through the cabin, but they were met with sharp glares from the man who had started the argument. The entire flight had become a battleground, and the stakes were higher than anyone had imagined. Meanwhile, the pilot, still holed up in the cockpit, had his hands clenched around the controls. His earlier bravado had all but disappeared, replaced by a growing panic. The tension in the cabin was seeping into the very bones of the plane. He knew that if the situation continued to spiral, he would lose whatever authority he had left. His job, his career, it all hung in the balance. The decisions made in these next few minutes could determine not just the outcome of this flight, but the future of his life in the force. The man who had started the new altercation, emboldened by the chaos he'd caused, turned once more to the woman's husband. "You want to be a hero. Fine, but don't drag us all into your fight. You're not the one who's going to be blamed when this plane is delayed and everyone's day is ruined." And with that, the flight attendants began to scramble in every direction. Some hurried toward the front of the cabin, communicating with the airline's headquarters, while others tried to calm the increasingly agitated passengers. But despite their best efforts, it was clear. This wasn't just a disagreement between two people anymore. This was an explosive showdown, a conflict that was as much about personal pride and power as it was about right and wrong. Every moment felt like it was winding up tighter and tighter, pushing the flight, and everyone on board closer to the brink. Would the passengers stand together, or would the toxic voices win out? Would the pilot finally give in to the pressure, or would he double down on his prejudices? The clock was ticking, and no one could say for sure how this would end, but the intensity was undeniable. Every second that passed was a step closer to the inevitable climax, and no one could predict what would happen when the final shoe dropped. The cabin was alive with tension as the voices of the man from the back and the woman's husband clashed, filling the air with anger and frustration. The plane seemed to be on the verge of boiling over when suddenly, the unmistakable hum of the intercom crackled to life. "This is Captain Davis," a calm, authoritative voice echoed through the speakers. "Please remain seated and calm. We are resolving this situation, but we ask that you respect the process." For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the sound of the woman's husband slowly exhaling, his gaze never leaving the pilot's seat. The man in the back, still bristling with anger, fell silent, but his eyes darted nervously as if expecting some kind of escalation. The flight attendants, caught between doing their job and managing the chaos, trying to usher the other passengers back into their seats, but the conflict was far from over. Then, as the passengers reluctantly began to sit back down, the unexpected happened. The cockpit door opened. Not the pilot, but the co-pilot, a woman in her late 20s, stepped into the cabin. Her uniform was crisply pressed, but there was no mistaking the resolve in her eyes. She approached the front of the cabin with a clear sense of purpose, her movements calm but deliberate. The room fell into stunned silence once again as everyone waited to see what she would do next. "I've been listening," she said quietly, her eyes scanning the cabin before landing on the pilot. "And I'm afraid I can't let this stand any longer." The passengers were confused. The woman was no longer speaking to the husband or the man from the back, but to the pilot. The air seemed to freeze around them as she walked toward the cockpit door, which the pilot had been trying to keep locked. His eyes widened with shock as she effortlessly slid the door open. "I'll be flying this plane today," she announced, her voice firm. The pilot was frozen, unable to react as she calmly moved into the cockpit and took his place. The tension in the cabin exploded into a mix of disbelief and awe. The woman, the co-pilot, had just taken control. But it was her next words that shocked everyone even more. "Captain Davis, I've known about your history for a long time. I've seen the way you've treated passengers, and I've heard the things you've said. And frankly, I'm done." The room was silent as the weight of her words sunk in. It wasn't just about the woman and her husband. It was about a systemic issue that had gone unchecked for far too long. The passengers, the flight attendants, they had all been part of this system without realizing it, accepting things that had been wrong for years. With the co-pilot now in charge, the pilot was escorted off the plane by security personnel. The woman's husband, still standing, glanced toward his wife, his expression softening as he realized what had just happened. The cabin was buzzing with the quiet murmurs of passengers who had witnessed the turn of events, many of them now speaking out in support of what had just transpired. But the final twist, the one that no one could have seen coming, was yet to unfold. Just as the flight attendants began to prepare the plane for takeoff, the woman who had challenged the husband earlier, the one who had sided with the pilot, stood up once again. This time, her voice wasn't filled with anger, but with an eerie calmness. She turned toward the husband, her eyes locking with his. "You don't know everything," she said softly. "The system wasn't built for you to win. But if you think this is over, you're wrong. There's more to this than you could ever imagine." The husband blinked, caught off guard by her words. Before he could respond, she turned away, disappearing into the back of the plane. It was clear that something deeper was at play, something that had just been set in motion, but that the passengers and the husband wouldn't fully understand until much later. As the plane began its descent toward the runway, the co-pilot, now fully in charge, looked at the woman sitting beside her husband. Her voice was soft, but there was a certain understanding between them. "You don't have to fight alone. Not anymore." The plane touched down, and as it taxied to the gate, passengers were left to process what had just happened. The confrontation between the racist pilot and the woman's family had sparked something much larger, a shift in the way people saw authority, and how they would now challenge it when necessary. But with the unexpected words of the woman in the back of the plane, it was clear that this moment, though monumental, was only the beginning of something far more complicated and potentially far more dangerous. As the passengers deplaned, there was no way to tell who would carry this moment forward. The story, it seemed, was far from over. Inside the coffee shop, the air seemed to shift once Karen stormed out. The barista, still trying to shake off the tension, turned back to the counter, wiping her hands on her apron as the next customer stepped up. The mood in the shop slowly returned to normal, until a group of regulars approached with wide smiles, clearly eager to show their support. One of them, a woman in a denim jacket, reached into her purse and pulled out a wad of cash, dropping it into the tip jar. "For dealing with that," she said, grinning ear to ear. The barista's face lit up with gratitude, and the others joined in, passing the jar around. The crowd, which had watched the confrontation unfold, gave a cheer of approval as the tips stacked up. It wasn't much, but it was a sign that despite the drama, They had all come together in a small moment of solidarity. It wasn't just the barista who felt the weight of the support. It was the entire shop, a community that had witnessed injustice being challenged. Outside, Karen's angry pacing could be seen through the coffee shop's large windows, her phone glued to her ear, no doubt attempting to salvage what remained of her perfect morning. The barista couldn't help but glance at her, a little smile playing at the corner of her mouth. But what happened next was the real twist. In the parking lot, Karen's day hit a new low. She walked up to her car, where a small, neatly folded note had been left on the windshield. Her eyes narrowed as she pulled it off and read aloud. "Thanks for parking like you own the place. Your Tao is on the house." The disbelief in her voice was palpable. She looked around, spotting a tow truck in the distance, and then, almost as if in slow motion, saw it begin to approach her car. It was like something out of a sitcom. The crowd of onlookers, who had been discreetly watching from the coffee shop window, burst into laughter at the perfect timing. Karen's face turned crimson as she marched over to the tow truck driver, her voice shrill and demanding. "You can't do this. I've got a permit. I was just in for a quick coffee." But her words were drowned out by the sound of the truck's winch starting up, pulling her car off the ground. Karen frantically tried to argue with the driver, waving her arms and stomping her feet, but it was clear no one was listening. The driver, with a calm but unwavering look, simply ignored her protests and continued with his job. As if that wasn't enough, a police officer arrived on the scene, summoned by complaints about Karen's illegal parking. With a nod to the tow truck driver, the officer approached Karen, who was now on the verge of a full-blown meltdown. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to issue a citation for obstructing traffic," the officer said, his tone professional but not without a hint of quiet amusement. Karen's face turned a deep shade of red as she sputtered in disbelief. "This is a mistake. You're all in on this. This isn't fair," she yelled, her voice rising in frustration. The officer remained calm, holding out the ticket with practiced ease. "You'll have to take it up with the tow company, ma'am. It's out of my hands." Her protests were no match for the situation she had found herself in. As the tow truck began to haul her car away, Karen's shoulders slumped in defeat. The crowd watched, phones raised, capturing every moment. The clips of Karen's meltdown were sure to go viral, spreading the story of her entitlement and the perfect karmic justice that had unfolded in front of them. As the scene wrapped up, the crowd started to disperse, each person with their own thoughts about the day's events. The barista stood behind the counter, still processing the whirlwind of the morning, a wide smile on her face. She wasn't sure what was more satisfying, the support from the regulars or the sweet taste of justice in the air as Karen's car was towed away. For everyone else, it had been a perfect, unforgettable moment, a reminder that the universe has a way of balancing things out, no matter how hard some people try to fight it. And as Karen walked off into the distance, her protests fading, the coffee shop returned to its peaceful rhythm. The regulars settled into their seats, the barista behind the counter, and the world outside went on, just a little more in balance than it had been that morning.